I looked in my calendar this morning, and today is 6 months since that crisis I had in January, where I really felt this major PTSD flashback. And I put it in my calendar to remind myself that it's been 6 months because I was having a sort of typical rhythm of re-experiencing crisis every 6 to 8.5 months. So I wanted to have in mind when the 6-month mark was, because I was planning to go to California, and I did, and I am still in California, and I leave for home in 6 days. And what a journey it has been, because I had a little bit of that scary energy come back a month after the crisis in January, and maybe it was about 2 months, around 1.5 months, I think. And so after that, I decided to taper off my medications, and I did that, and then I've been off of them for 7 weeks, which is amazing, and I feel great. And I've been really busy here this last week, so I won't really get to make that many videos. And even when I get home, I just want to really focus on being around the people that I've been away from for so long, so I won't make too many videos there either. So hopefully my next real wave of videos with myself will be in September-ish, when the weather starts getting crappy where I'm from, and maybe I'll have a new iPhone and maybe a new computer to maybe make the quality a bit better for some reason. I don't know why. And then, yeah. And it's funny how one can just be going along doing something and not even realize something very simple that somebody pointed out to me, that the iPhone camera, the front camera, is a lot crappier than the back camera. The back camera is the 4K camera, and the front one is just up to 720. And I don't think it really matters anyway, because the bigger videos would take a lot longer to save and upload to YouTube, and also take up a lot more memory on the phone, so it would take longer to upload to iCloud, blah blah blah. So it's not really important, but I just never realized that if I did want to make a better quality video, I'd have to flip the camera around, which makes it a little more difficult to tell if I'm in the middle of the thing. Not that that matters, but I just thought that was interesting how I never really thought about that. And it didn't really matter anyway, but interesting. So now I know, after a whole year, that if I wanted to make a better video with my iPhone, I'd have to use the front camera. I never quite understood that. And front camera as in the non-selfie cam. Maybe that's the back camera. Whatever. And I think in the last video I was talking about that article written about all these wonderful sound bites about making a decision to take medication, and how it's misleading if applied to people with bipolar or schizophrenia diagnoses. And I don't think it actually implied that in the article, but on the tweet it actually said why it's important for people with schizophrenia and bipolar to have meds as an important part of the treatment plan. And then the article is talking about decision making. So I feel it's misleading, because if it was an article about reasons to stay on medications after one had been basically forcibly put on them in the hospital, then that would be a different story. But it sounds to me like it's mainly people who actually did get to make a decision, and maybe that it includes some people with diagnoses of bipolar and schizophrenia labels, but in my case it wasn't this decision that I made. I was just put on them in the hospital, and I'm not saying that to change that fact. Nothing can change that fact, and I wouldn't even change it anyways, but it's just misleading to think that everybody who goes on psych meds just makes this wonderful informed decision. And something that I didn't talk about was how if one starts a medication, even after a couple of weeks, it can be very difficult to taper off the medication. So if somebody starts taking it and they're like, I don't want to take this, it doesn't make me feel good, and then doesn't take it anymore, there could actually be worse side effects of coming off the medications or worsening of symptoms, supposedly that's actually just withdrawal from the medication. So the body becomes addicted to the medication very quickly, and then when one tries to not take it anymore, if the risks and the side effects are worse than the original distress or trouble, then the distress and trouble can actually get worse than the original because of the addictive effects of the medication. And then one thinks, well, maybe I do need this medication. Things are getting worse. So it can actually cause a lot more problems. And then it's actually seen as justifying further treatment or switch to a different medication or the need for medication. So to imply that one is really making an informed decision is not really correct. And Dr. Kelly Brogan talks about this. She talks about how she realized that she wasn't giving people informed consent when they went on meds. She wasn't telling them, if you take this for more than a couple weeks or a couple months, you might actually have worse symptoms or worse manifestations of this distress than you did before. For illustration purposes, somebody might have anxiety and go on a medication and then afterwards have suicidal thoughts and trying to come off the medication, and then thinks, oh wow, I really need this medication. But really, it's the body withdrawing from the medication. And in my case, for example, and I don't really think about this that often because it was so long ago, and I've been more focused on the journey, I was having really terrible so-called psychosis, and I was put in the hospital, and I was put on the medication, and it gave me akathisia, and I wanted to just jump off a bridge, and at the same time really not wanting to jump off a bridge. So it nearly killed me. And that's not really a withdrawal effect, that was just a really terrible side effect. And then I had flat affect, and it was very difficult for me to advocate that I need to go back to the hospital in order to change the meds. And instead of thinking, wow, this medication had a really bad effect on you, maybe you don't need them at all, that's just, well, we'll put you on something different. So the initial medication making me so much worse justified trying a different one that apparently made me better, but maybe it just made me better from the initial worsening of that first medication that I was put on that really did not agree with me whatsoever. I really wonder if I would have just been put on short-term antipsychotics for a week or two to reconnect me to reality and then taken off of them, if I would have needed anything at all. And I'll never know. I'm just really wondering. And maybe I would have needed something. Now I'm supporting all of this with hearty nutritional micronutrients, and I feel a lot better for sure. And my main concern for the next step is when I go back home, will it be information overload? Will I feel bombarded? Will it feel super noisy? Will it feel like too much information that the micronutrients aren't really enough to help my nervous system process? And it's not like medication would be so magical that it would help me process information. It wouldn't. It would actually just numb me out to processing the information overload, which I feel still kind of accumulates as allostatic load in the body and the subconscious mind, which just eventually builds up to a crisis because the medication can no longer numb out on all the information, because the information still goes somewhere. There's still an aspect of our being that is processing something. If we see something that is triggering, yet we're not triggered because of the meds, our body still senses that. It's still afraid. And it actually makes it worse in a way because it has to be processed later. And for example, if somebody is drugged and then suffers some kind of trauma because of something, after the drug wears off, they'll be traumatized. So if somebody gets drugged and then raped, for example, when the drug that put the person unconscious wears off, it's not like the body doesn't remember. It's not like there's not some aspect that did have an awareness of what was happening. So in that same way, when withdrawing from a long-term psych med, all that trauma that got delayed by virtue of numbing oneself out with medication is going to actually present to the surface, and that's part of what makes the withdrawal more difficult. So it's not that meds are bad, it's just it's not the solution to the problem, and everything will still continue to pile up. And as it piles up and it's not really dealt with, and the moment isn't even dealt with because we're not able to see what we need to face and communicate, that builds up over time, and then somebody has a relapse. And I've had 4 relapses in the last 2.5 years, and partly because I was working in peer support, and it's really traumatizing to see what's happening to people like me. And then I was on meds, so that would just build up really quickly, and then no amount of medication can stop one from really feeling and seeing what's happening there. So that's why I really don't think I can go back to it and look at it, because it's just so awful. I can sit at a distance and talk about it, but I don't think I really would last that long going back to work in it. And that's why I really prefer this form of passive advocacy, because if I'm not able to communicate, then it's of little use. And I read another disturbing tweet saying that addictions are now described as a brain disorder and not a behavioral problem. And I actually read this article that I didn't go into too much because I could have probably just talked about it for an hour, and I don't want to go on and on too much about things, even though I do. It was actually in a Scientology magazine talking about how they're changing everything like addictions to be brain disorders just so they can have best practice, best treatment, first line of treatment as medication. And it's really sad to me. But then they'll be, well, at least people are getting treatment because if we agree to take meds, they'll give us a lot of other things. But if we don't, then we can just be homeless on the street. We don't get housing and things like that. If we're self-directing what type of medicine we want to take, even if it is something that is not patented and sold by a legal drug dealer called a doctor or a psychiatrist. So relapse, in a way, is tripping over the crutch of medication. It's a crutch that can help to buy time to figure out how to face certain things, but it's not going to stop it from coming back indefinitely. Maybe in some people, but even if a person was able to really if a person is able to be on meds and then really move into dealing with the things that one had a sense were leading to crisis or struggle while on the meds, then maybe one will never have a relapse. But if one actually goes into situations that are going to cause more distress, things are going to pile up really quickly. So I was on medications for 3.5 years before I had any so-called relapse, because I was just sort of having fun, working at a medical office, no real stress, being really social and laughing a lot. And then I went into peer support, and seeing all that happening really bothered me. And no amount of medication could stop that resonating with that trauma of what's happening to people, because it's happened to me. And then it happened again in April of 2016, which was just as bad as that very first time, which could have then justified another med change. Well, it was a med change that did that to me. And so, yeah, there's a lot to say about that stuff, but I just don't really like how it's purported as not risky when those types of medications, especially the long-term antipsychotics, nearly killed me twice. So to act like it's an informed decision that the risks are better than the side effects is not true. I had to be taken off those drugs really quickly in order to not end my life. So, and there's a problem there when the psychiatrist has the power to just give it in a setting like a psych ward where one doesn't have a choice. And had I had to stay on that medication and been discharged on that medication, I probably would have ended my life. And people do that. And we would never try to run a marathon with a crutch. And life really is a marathon. So if somebody gets injured, they use a crutch for a while and then they ditch the crutch. I really feel there's a time to throw away the crutch. And it's not a frivolous thing. It has to be done very, very carefully. If we don't throw away the crutch, it's very difficult to dance in all directions. And I also want to throw a little game element into this video because it's been so boring and repetitive. So the game element is that I've been thinking of creating an altruism quarter game and just putting a note with a quarter, and if someone finds it, follows the clue, they get some sort of prize. So I found a bill that says, and I wonder if anyone can answer the question, who is it that wrote that? And if you can, you get a prize. And I'll likely include this other letter that I took a picture of at some point and ask who wrote that. So we'll see if anyone knows the answer, or if anyone finds the same thing that I just showed, and that would be another prize. It reminds me of that movie Serendipity, and I would like to live more by serendipity, synchronicity, eureka, and that other term that kind of relates to that. And then the last thing I want to talk about today is a couple of days ago, it flashed in my mind that when I was young, really young, I had sort of this little file of papers, or I had these little books that I would call my importance. And I just had this sense that these papers I had and this information was really important. And I would draw a computer book like that character Penny had in the cartoon Inspector Gadget. And I thought it was so cool. And now we do have computer books in terms of tablets and smartphones. So I just really flashed on how I was really born with this awareness of information. And at home I have a whole shelf full of books, and then a whole shelf full of things I printed off and collected in terms of research in health and now in mental health. So I just thought it was really interesting how as a child I wasn't dancing around or anything like that. I had this sense of these importance, and it was just always there, and I've always had that. And maybe I'll talk about that more later, but I just really was surprised by that realization that I've always had my notebooks of information even before I could write. It was always a way that I organized myself, including all the world around me. That's good enough for today.